Hey guys, this is Tyler again with noobgrammar.com. Let's get started with this one. Okay, let's go ahead and open our aggregator solution to where we left off in the last one. There's a couple of things we need to do before we start coding. So the first thing we need to do is prettify this list box here. So click on it, go over to your properties, go up to font or down depending on where you're at. Let's just make this a little bit bigger. I don't know, is 15 too big? That'll work. And the other thing we need to do is we need to change the selection mode of this list so that we can select more than one item at a time. And the way you do that, back in your properties window, go down to selection mode, change this to multi-extended. So the first line of code we need to change is actually going to be in the Parser class from the XML Parser library that we created in the first video. So let's go ahead and open it. Now I'll paste this in here and explain what it does. Let's fix the squigglies. Okay. So to explain what this does, we need to take a step back and look what we're trying to accomplish with our Parser library. So our Parser library, whenever it gets a URL in, it establishes a connection with that website and then pulls the data back across. Now, the protocol over which that connection is established can be any number of things: SSL2, SSL3, TLS, TLS 1.1, TLS 1.2. Now, of course, SSL2 and SSL3 are not secure, so we just want to allow our app to connect over these three protocols: the TLS and TLS 1.2 and TLS 1.1. And that's essentially what this line is doing. Whenever I first created this project, this was a pretty big bug I ran into. So some of the feeds would work and some of them wouldn't. So I did a quick Google and found a whole bunch of stuff on Stack Overflow, and they pretty much all said the same thing: use this line. I don't know all of the specifics about it, but essentially the Service Point Manager is we'll call it a static class that sits there and manages all of our behind the scenes HTTP requests. And this security protocol is just a setting that you can set for the Service Point Manager. Okay, now we can move into our actual form. So let's go ahead and save everything. And we don't need this file anymore. Okay, so go ahead and double click on all of your buttons to add the click event. Okay, and I'm going to go ahead and create three classes that we're going to need. So make sure you're in the aggregator app, add a new folder, call it classes. The first one's going to be a feed class. The next one's going to be a feed managers class. And the last one is going to be an invalid feed exception class. So these three classes are going to accomplish a few things. The feed class is going to hold all of our feed data. It's going to have an XML parser object, and then it's going to have some other things in it. The feeds manager class is going to represent our configuration manager stuff. And I've got a video on that that'll explain that a little bit better. And then the invalid feed exception is just going to be an extension of the exception class that we can use to throw an exception when we need it. So let's go ahead and look at our feed class. I'm going to paste some code in here. Let's go ahead and fix the squigglies. Okay, and that's got them all fixed except for this one, but we'll talk about that in a minute. So we've got some properties of the feed here that we're going to use later on when we're ready to display the information from this feed. our constructor just takes a name and a URL. So all we want to do whenever we create this is say, hey, this is what it's called, and this is the website that you're going to try to connect to. Then we have a method called load feed that's going to take care of creating the parser and establishing that connection. And we're doing a try catch here because if we have an invalid URL, we want to catch that and do something with it that's meaningful rather than just let that bubble on up to the user. And that's where this invalid feed exception comes from, or comes into play. And I'll talk about that more whenever we actually create it. Then we have this map to parser method, which all it does is it goes through our RSS parser and just maps the various properties to the properties in the feed. Then we have the update feed, which again it just reloads the feed, and this is useful if we have the same feed displayed over a long period of time and we want to say, hey, let's make sure this is up to date. Well, we just update the feed and then we have the new information. And then finally we have this override string, and all we're doing there is just making it to where we can actually get useful information about this object rather than the class name whenever we call it. Now before we get into the feeds manager, let's go ahead and take care of this invalid feed exception. So let's save this, go to the invalid feed exception CS file, and let's paste some more code in here. And before I explain this, we need to tell this class to extend the exception class. So colon exception. Okay, so we have three different constructors here. The first constructor doesn't take anything. The second constructor just takes a message, and then the third constructor takes a message and then an exception for the parameters. And that's pretty much all we really need to do here. And yes, technically there's not really a good reason for us to create our own exception here since we're not doing anything fancy in these constructors. So we could have just thrown a regular exception, but I wanted to throw this in there here just to touch on, again, extending exceptions and creating your own, so in case you ever needed to in the future, you would kind of know how to do it. And then if we go back to our feed class, our this squiggly is fixed. So finally, let's go ahead and look at our feed manager class. So I'm going to paste some code in. Let's fix the squigglies. And we can't have Visual Studio generate our using directive for us. In this case, we have to add a reference to that DLL first. So right click on references, add reference, go down to system.configuration. Okay, now we should be able to generate the using directive. Come on. Alright, and that looks like it's got them all. So I'm not going to go through all of this code because there's quite a bit here. I think there's something like 100 lines. Yeah, something around 100. I have a second video that covers the configuration manager in more detail. But in a nutshell, this class will handle the configuration file that Visual Studio will create for us. We're going to be able to use that to save and edit feeds that are going to be persistent for our users each time they open this app. So I'll take one of these and kind of break it down. So if we want to add a feed to the config, we want to make sure that the feed name is unique, so we're not having two configuration settings with the same key. And then so we're going to open the file, we're going to add the feed name and the feed URL. So the settings.add function takes a key and then the data associated with that key, and that's why we're passing name and URL. Then we're going to save it, and then we're going to refresh it so that the next time we try to modify it, it says, hey, I've made changes to it. You might want to go make sure you reopen it and have the latest version. And then if the feed name is not unique, then we're going to throw an exception. That way we can let the user know that, hey, you've already used this before, pick something else. And that's kind of a similar concept throughout the rest of these. And again, go check out the Configuration Manager video for a much better understanding of how all this works. And I will touch on these just a little bit more as we're going through the code for the form. So let's go ahead and hop on over to that and take a look at it. So we've already got all of our click events created for our buttons, but let's look at our list box. Now this is where we're going to display all of the saved feeds to our user and let them delete and update and of course add new ones. So we're going to need some functions to help handle that. So I'm going to go ahead and paste them in. So the first function here is the load list box function, and we're passing in a list box and an array of objects. Then we're just going to loop through the array, and then we're going to call this add items to list box function using that same list box and then the item that we're at in the array. So add items to list box actually handles adding the item to list box. Imagine that. And the same thing for remove item and then update item. I'll come back to this in a second. But the reason why I'm doing it this way instead of just hard coding in the name of the list box here, if at any point in time we wanted to go back and change the name of our list box, or let's say we had another list box that we wanted to use somewhere else, we would have to go through and rewrite these functions or create new functions in order to handle either case. So let's go ahead and go back to the update items and list box function. So we're taking in an old item and a new item. So as you might imagine, the old item is going to be replaced by the new item, and the way we do that, we can use array notation, and we're going to find the index of the old item. So we're going to go and figure out, okay, where in this item array does the old item fall, and then whenever we find it, we're going to replace it with the new item. So there's one more helper function I want to paste into here, and it's just an alert method that takes a string and then obviously displays the message back to the user. And I'm doing it this way again to kind of follow the same logic that we followed with the passing in a list box as a parameter. If we want to change the way we're showing this message, we just have to change it in one place, and then that will cascade and change it everywhere we use this alert function. Alright, moving forward, I think that's just about all of our helper functions. So I'm going to go ahead and paste another one in up here under the ag form constructor. And we're just going to call this one load app. So, oh, okay, I forgot to declare a variable here. So private feeds manager, and we got to fix this squiggly. Okay. So all we're really doing here is creating a method that's going to do a few things for us whenever our app loads. So let's go ahead and call it. Now we're just creating an instance of our feeds manager, and then we're going to use that load list box helper to go ahead and load all of those feeds that our configuration manager, the feeds manager, creates, and load them into the text box or the list box. So let's go ahead and look at the add feed button. So what we're going to do first is we're going to make sure that the easy name and the feed URL text fields are not empty. And remember, that's just these two fields. If they are empty, then we want to tell the user that. So this Metro message box is just the Metro Modern UI version of the message box. And so the prompt is the string that we're actually going to ask the user. This is just the instance of the form, so this form. The message box buttons, OK and cancel, so those are going to be the buttons that the user can press. And then this message box icon.information is essentially the theme, the color, if you will, of the message box. Let's go ahead and fix these squigglies real quick too while we're at it, because that bugs me. Come on. So assuming that there was text in those two fields, we're going to try to create a new feed based off that information. Then we're going to try to add it to our configuration manager in the feeds manager. And lastly, we're going to add the item to the list box. Now, if there was a problem adding the feed to the config, we are going to basically tell the user that. And this x.message will be a message that's returned from the feeds manager class. So if we go to the add feed to config, and if it fails, then this is going to be the message that we get. So the feed name must be unique. So that's a really easy way to handle your errors and handle your user input whenever it screws up. That way we can just tell the user exactly what happened. Let's move on down to the Edit Selected Feed button. So again, we're just building the string, and we're going to use the message box here. Whenever a user tries to make a change to something, we want to make sure that they actually meant to make a change to that configuration. So that's what we're doing here. Again, we're just building a message box and showing it to the user. Whenever they press one of these buttons, if they press the yes button, then we're going to do all this stuff. But we also want to make sure that they actually have selected a feed. And I haven't talked about this feeds manager.selected feed. I'll talk about that in a later function. And then we just want to make sure that there's an item in the list box selected as well. Okay, let's move on down to the delete section. So again, we're building the Metro message box again the same way we did for the edit button, except this time we just want to make sure that they have at least selected one item. And if you remember that when we first started this, we changed this selection mode to multi-extended. This allows us to have more than one item selected, so we can delete 2 or 3 feeds, or how many ever you need to. We can delete them all at once. So we're just going to loop through all of the items in the selected items. We're going to try to remove it, and we have to cast it to a feed first, because if you remember, the items in the selected items array here, they're just generic objects. So we have to cast them to a feed first, so that way we can get the name value associated with that feed that we can use as a key to pass into our remove feed from config function. So that's what this is doing here. It doesn't look the greatest, but I don't know any other way to do it. And then we're going to remove the item from the list box, and if there was a problem, of course, we're going to alert the user and tell them what was going on. Now, I would like to point out that we are using a descending array instead of an ascending array. And the reason why we're doing that is just to make sure that we are actually removing every item. If you remove items while you're counting up, your count changes, and sometimes that can leave items out and orphan them. Alright, we're almost there. There's one more function and action that we need to do, and we need to go back to our form, and we need to add what amounts to a listener that says whenever the selected index in this list box changes, we need to do something. So let's go ahead and click on it, go to the actions or the events button over here, go down to, what is this, selected index change, and then just double click it. And now I'm going to paste some code in. Now remember, this only fires whenever the index is changed, the selected index is changed. And deleting one of the items in the box also fires this event. And when that happens, the selected item becomes null. So assuming that there is something selected, so assuming that we didn't just delete something and we just clicked on something, then we want to select or set the selected feed in our feeds manager equal to the item that is selected in the list box. And this is where that feeds manager selected feed comes into play. So whenever we set our feeds manager, then we need to set the text of the selected feed and the selected feed URL equal to the appropriate data. And again, those two text fields are just this one and this one. Now, if we did delete an item, then we want to set these two fields to blank lines so that they're not trying to edit anything. Now, if everything went well, we should be able to test our project. Let's add a feed. I'm going to call this one Harold Baldwin. And this is just a feed from Computer World. So we should be able to add it. Let's add a different one. Let me find another one. This one's going to be Tracy Mayer. And we can add it. Let's try to edit one. Then we get our confirmation box. And then let's see what happens when we try to rename it to the same as this other one. Oh, then we get our alert message that said it would not work. So let's just try to delete it. So it looks like we do have a bug here. Let me go ahead and close it out and see what happens when we reopen it. Okay, so the feed was deleted at some point. Let's dig in and see where that bug is. So assuming that our delete button works the way it's supposed to, we have to start by assuming that there was something went wrong within our edit function. And if we go back into our edit function and look at it, so there's two things that happened here. One, we had to update the feed in the config, and the other one was updating the item in the list box. So I think what's happening here is that we are removing the old item before we're checking to make sure that the new item is unique. So if the new item is not unique, then that item doesn't get added, but then we've already removed the old item. So unfortunately, because our update item in listbox function is not handled in the feeds manager class, we're also not getting that feedback in the list box, so that item is not getting removed. So this should be a really easy fix. If we go to feeds manager, we should be able to change the order in which we do this. Take these out and let's run it. Then we pull this back in to test it one more time. See if it'll let us rename it. We can't rename it. And now we can delete it. So let's go ahead and add it back. And just for completeness, let's make sure we can delete it normally. Yes, we can. Alright, thank you guys for watching this next video in the RSS Aggregator series. Remember, noobgrammar.com, if you want to go check that out. There will be a blog post that corresponds with this video, and I'll post a link to that in the description, and I'll post a link to all the GitHub code in the description as well. So until next time, thanks.